Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Dan Mazur, discussing his latest graphic novel, Lunatic. He is joined in conversation tonight by Whit Taylor. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of Lunatic, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you so much for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. As an added bonus, Dan will be signing copies of his book before we ship them out, so be sure to order one. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last months, technical issues may arise and animals may show up behind you. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Dan Mazur is an independent cartoonist, journalist, teacher, screenwriter, and editor. He is co-founder of the Boston Comics Roundtable and MICE, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. He is the co-writer of Comics, A Global History, and has taught comic art at the Art Institute of Boston, the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, and the Brookline Art Center, as well as screenwriting at UCLA Extension School. He is joined tonight by Whit Taylor, who is an Ignatz-Award winning cartoonist, editor, and public health educator from New Jersey. Her comics have been published by The Nib, The New Yorker, Ninth Art Press, Radiator Comics, and Rosarium Publishing, among others. She is currently a contributing editor at The Nib. Her graphic novel with Casimir Lee, Harriet, Toward Freedom, will be published in 2021. Today they are discussing Lunatic. Lunatic is a striking graphic novel in the tradition of wordless books. It is part fable, part classic adventure, told in nearly 200 full-page wordless images in a variety of media, from pencil, pen and ink, ink wash, and paint. In Lunatic, we follow the protagonist through infancy, childhood, youth, and adulthood, at each point guided by the moon toward a fateful journey and an unexpected destiny. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. Dan, Whit, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by, wait, am I audible? Yes. By attempting a reading of a wordless book. And readings of comics are always kind of funny anyway, with the cartoonists like reading the word balloons aloud and showing the pictures. But this will be even more unusual. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, share screen. Yep. And start with the cover. We seeing it? Good. So this is the cover of Lunatic, which I designed kind of to look at like various Victorian children's books, and old-fashioned hardcovers, including the phony strip of yellow down the left side, which would have been as though there was a paper binding there, but I just scanned the cover of an old book, and so there's that texture on it if you look closely. So this is the cover, and now we go to page 1. Oh yes, the chapter pages, which again repeat that Victorian design that I cribbed from an old book for the cover, but I wanted these chapter pages to look like silent movie title cards. And here's page 1. It's a bird's eye view of a city street, clearly Victorian. I based it and the other street scenes on old photographs of London. And this chapter, in each chapter of this book, I use different media to draw it with. The first chapter is mostly Conte crayon with some India ink to kind of enhance the blacks. And since this is kind of the Conte crayon, I thought both evoked the sooty old London, but also the kind of sootiness with which I experienced anyway, very early memories. Like there's something kind of gray and mysterious about your earliest memories, for me anyway. So this is page 1, looking down on the city, and towards the center of the page, this nanny pushing a pram. Page 2, we looking from the side at the nanny with her pram. Again, Conte crayon, a little ink for the black lines. And now we see the passenger in the pram, the baby looking up languorously, if that's a word. And then the point of view from the pram, looking up at the rooftops and clouds and the moon. And I did change media here a little bit. I used gray and white paint, acrylic paint, for the roofs and for the moon, which gives it a kind of a softer look than the Conte crayon, which is still shading the clouds. Back to the baby, looking up a little less languorously, a little more attentive. And I think that the two black pupils of her eyes are the only ink on this page. Kind of exaggerated that look, that stare. Another point of view closer on the moon, the clouds moving across the moon. Something's going on. And then you turn the page for the big reveal of the moon smiling down, very friendly. And then back to the baby reacting with helpless yearning, I would say. And that's the end of chapter 1 of the book. Go on to a little of chapter 2. Starting again on a different angle of a Victorian city street, row houses, a little bit different architecture with the that kind of slanted roof over the attic room. I don't know what the word for that is. And this chapter is drawn all with India ink and ink washes, meaning the black ink is diluted to various degrees to create grays. And now we're inside the room, the top room in that house with the slanted roof, slanted ceilings. And this, when I drew this, I was having some shoulder problems on my right shoulder, and it didn't affect my drawing at all, but it worried me, what if it got worse and I can't draw with my right hand? So I thought I'd better learn to draw with my left hand. So this chapter, I did pencil sketch with my right hand, but all the ink drawing is done with left hand. And that was kind of freeing because it gave me this tremble that I could never have done on purpose with my right hand. And I liked the wiggly lines that resulted. And so this is a child's room, pretty clearly a well-off child with every possible toy strewn around the room. A little bit, I think, gives the impression of maybe a spoiled child, didn't need to clean up the room either. We go in and page by page, get just a better look at some of these toys. I think I made up this Cossack Jack in the Box. And the book there, the top book is a tribute to The Golden Key by George MacDonald, which is one of my favorite pieces of children's literature. Very mysterious and haunting and kind of melancholy. And underneath it is From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne, which is also appropriate tribute. Then The Empty Bed. Someone's gotten out of bed, even though it's nighttime. You see the feet, the girl's feet in her nightgown, facing the wall. One last cameo by a toy, limp stuffed rabbit, looking at us. In the back of her head, looking out over the roofs of whatever city this might be, at the distant moon. And then this is the image that I put on the cover also, looking down slightly above as she looks out the window, those two little round eyes, hopefully connecting her with the baby that she was in the previous chapter. And I'll leave it there. You can get the rest of it when you read the book.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to talk with you, Dan, about your book. I kind of watched you online as you were working on it, and you were posting pages, and I had no clue what it was about. But I was eagerly waiting to see what it would look like when it came together. And it's just like, I've read it several times. It's just like a fantastic book. So just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. One of the first people I sent it to.
Oh, cool. I appreciate that. So should we just want to start chatting about it? You good?
Yeah.
Okay.
How are you doing?
I'm doing
well.
About
the book. Oh.
Yes, yeah. About the book.
Yeah.
So why, yeah. I mean, I noticed that like why did you choose to do a wordless book? What was your reasoning for that?
Well, I think I've done a lot of wordless comics, and I don't know exactly why that really appeals to me. I mean, there's sort of a purity to it. There've been wordless comics over the years, and like there were a few of them in the newspapers when I was a kid. I remember there was one called Mr. Mum, which is just about, it was in the Boston Globe, and it was about a guy who just walked around seeing strange things. And the last panel of every strip, he's sitting in a health food restaurant drinking carrot juice, which at the time seemed hilarious to me, the idea of carrot juice. But yeah, I don't know if I can answer it better than that there's a kind of a pure comic storytelling to wordless comics. Not to say that comics with word balloons are in any way adulterated or impure, but for me, that the appeal of just telling stories with pictures is really strong.
It seems like it would take, I mean, it's like a different skill set in some ways when you're not relying on text to add that detail,
Yeah.
Because you're purely relying on visual storytelling. And so like one thing that stands out to me in your book is like how you use light, I think how you use moonlight throughout it, how you use facial expressions, like just like the little details like that. That's just like so thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
And pacing really, but we can talk about that more.
Yeah, and I think it's like I was talking with Sarah, the host, beforehand about, kind of the temptation to just read the words sometimes. We were talking about how if like you have closed captioning on a movie, even if it's in a language you understand, you end up kind of reading the words. So I think it's like it kind of forces the reader to just pay attention to what you can do visually, and it's a challenge to make sure that it tells the story.
Yeah. What was your inspiration for the story?
Okay, that's a good question. Like the story just kind of popped into my head, so I've had to sort of reconstruct the inspirations after the fact. I'm going to share my screen again, because after I had done it, let me see if I can find this. I found this 2-page comic that I had done, really just really fast and loose and forgotten about. And it had this couple looking up at the moon very romantically, and then the man is like pulled up to the moon and separated from her, and she's crying, and he gets to the moon and he's there all alone, and it's very bleak. So for some reason this idea was in my head, and then I remembered when I was much younger, like in college, I was doing acting, and I read this play, the play Wojciech by George Buchner, and there was a monologue in it where an old grandmother tells a bedtime story to her child, and it made a big impression. I'm going to read the monologue.
Okay.
Once upon a time, there was a poor child with no father and no mother, and everything was dead. And no one was left in the whole world. Everything was dead. And the child went and searched day and night. And since nobody was left on the earth, it wanted to go up into the heavens. And the moon was looking at it so friendly. And when it finally got to the moon was a piece of rotten wood. And then it went to the sun. And when it got there, the sun was a wilted sunflower. And when it got to the stars, they were little golden flies stuck up there like the shrike sticks them on a blackthorn. And when it wanted to go back down to earth, the earth was an overturned piss pot, and the child was all alone, and it sat down and cried, and it is there till this day, all alone. So at the age of 20, I found that delightful. But I realized that there was something about that sort of the moon being distant and beautiful, and both this romantic image of mythology and fable, and also the more we learn about it, it's just a big cold dead rock in the sky, and it's both of those things at once. So somehow that inspired the story, I think.
Well, I mean, after hearing that, that totally, like, it doesn't like totally shift my perception of the story, but it definitely adds a lot of context, and I feel like I would enjoy it regardless. But
well, the story, yeah, let me just caution anyone out there. The story is not that bleak. It kind of it toys with bleakness a little bit, but it's not like that. But I think I had to sort of work against that kind of depressing thing, which you might like when you're basically an adolescent, but then it's like, no.
Well, just like stepping back a little bit, when did you get into comics in general? What was kind of your journey with that? How did it start?
Well, as a kid, reading superhero comics and wanted to be a comic book artist when I grew up, and I think I drew comics, through high school, a little into college. I wasn't disciplined enough to really finish anything, but I think I still wanted to be a comic book artist. And then I was an art major in college, but it was like the late 70s, and there was really no idea in art school or anywhere else that comics was, a worthwhile thing to pursue. I have great admiration for the people who pursued it at that time anyway. But for me, it kind of, my ambition withered from neglect, and I went and did other things. And I was working in screenwriting, But I think I just always thought that someday I would somehow get back to it. And when I was about 40, I read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which is about comic book artists, and it kind of clicked something in me. And so I started to fool around with comics again. And around that same time, my wife Susan became editor of the newspaper in our town, small town newspaper. And I said, well, oh, can I draw a comic strip? Of course, she said yes. And so for 4 years, I had pretty much carte blanche from my editor to draw whatever I wanted in comic strip. And at that same time, like, I didn't realize it, but it was this new era in independent comics that was starting up, with where self-publishing became a thing, and people had scanners and Photoshop, and people were just making their own comics, mini comics. Oh, and here is Exhibit 1, a mini comic. Happens to be the Ignatz winning Fizzle by Whit Taylor.
Thank you. Very kind.
So anyway, so I started making mini comics out of the strips I was doing, but then the big thing also was I moved back to Boston, to Cambridge, and got involved and helped start Boston Comics Roundtable, which is a great community of cartoonists, and that just kind of super accelerated both the amount of comics that I was exposed to, the amount of people who were doing it at the same time. I mean, it just, like, everything became possible. And I think that also, having been in the movie business, the difference between, like, trying to get a movie made and making a comic, you can just do anything in comics for almost no money to just a little bit of money.
Yeah, I mean, right out of college, I had an interest in film, especially documentary film. And I feel like I figured out early on the kind of how you have a lot more control, for instance, in comics compared to being in, like, the film industry. But I met you, I think, through Boston Comics Roundtable and going to MICE, like, over a decade ago. And that's when I lived in Boston for a little while. I just remember it being a really welcoming group, all sorts of folks doing all sorts of things in comics, and it still exists to this day, it was very important, fundamental for me as a beginning cartoonist to feel like I had, like, people that, like, I could connect with over this, like, shared love. And around that time too, I don't know if that's when you were starting Ninth Art Press, but that's certainly, like, when I learned about it. So you're also a publisher.
Yeah, because I mean, that's what I mean. You can do, anything, publishing a comic. I mean, from a mini comic is really cheap, but even, like, a real book with a spine, and and so I got into publishing anthologies through Boston Comics Roundtable, and that's how I ended up publishing this one, Subcultures, edited by Whit Taylor, and we both contributed stories to it. But yeah, I mean, it's just like, this is like a really nice book, and it was just affordable to print it.
That's how I got my start editing, honestly. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. Yeah, so I want to make sure we get back to your book, so we can. What about, like, your artistic influences? So you mentioned that you majored in art when you were in college. Did you draw anything from, like, that era of your life for this book, or more recent interests?
Well, my dad was an artist, so I just saw a lot of art and a fair amount of art making as a kid. And he never, and my mom was a writer, and neither of them ever, like, discouraged me from liking, Green Lantern or Aquaman as my personal artistic pinnacle at the age of 10. But so there's a lot of artistic influences. I'm going to share my screen again. So yeah, so I did look at a lot of different artistic styles for this book, and different for different chapters. Like chapter 4, I was looking at sort of 19th century French artists like Vuillard. This is Herman Paul, Toulouse-Lautrec. But I think if there's like an overarching inspirational artist for me when I was starting this book, it was Alberto Breccia, who is an Argentinian comic artist. And what I love about Breccia was he started, in the 1940s or 50s, and he was really doing very conventional comics, learning the lessons from the great comic strip artists like Milton Caniff of Terry and the Pirates, and Alex Raymond, who did Rip Kirby. And as the years went on, he just got better and better and bringing that sort of style to really great heights. But then he kept going and experimenting with different media and different styles. So here's a page from a comic he did in the late 60s, where he's drawing with ink and I don't know what liquids on glass and getting textures that are more like printmaking than anything you would see in comics. And then started working in color and clearly like drawing on expressionism and other styles of modern art. So I think, so I did this comic called The Ghost, which is written by a friend of mine, Troy Minkowski, and it's just a spoof of 1940s superhero comics, but written in this very insane, crazy style. So I started trying to use in that different artistic styles. So like on this page, I'm doing some copies of George Grosz, and then in the top and panel and that middle panel, trying to evoke like social realism. This is Reginald Marsh. And I drew that, and I just like, instead of penciling and inking it, I just drew it in Conti crayon. I just drew it straight onto the paper without penciling and inking. And I was so happy with the way this looked, and it felt so different. But I felt like, well, I don't want that to be just one little panel on the page. I want people to see this big. And I think that was kind of how the second part of the answer, why a wordless book, is like, this is why I wanted each page to be its own picture, because I just wanted this kind of presence for each page.
Thank you. I definitely I see where you drew your influence from. It's really great.
Thanks.
I mean, speaking of process, like what is your process? What did your process look like for this book, and how has it kind of differed from other things that you've done? Did you do, for instance, like multiple drafts? Like what did it look like for you?
It started, the story started before I had the idea of the wordless book. And Frank Santoro, who is a kind of a cartoonist and a teacher and a journalist, and he would have this contest based on his style of doing comics, which is very kind of rigid, and it's got to be the 6-panel or 8-panel grid with every image the same size, and that was actually what I was going to do this book as, before that urge to do like big full-page drawings hit me. So I did like a normal thumbnail, like you would for a normal comic, and I continued to do that, but the difference was, like, I'd really been into page composition and layout in comics, and really getting into how the eye moves across the page, left to right and up to down, and in this book, where it's just one image per page, is totally different. So not only is you like think about each image, but it's all about just the relationship between these two images. And then the page turn becomes really important for the flow of the story, because you don't spend your time kind of moving within on page. So it's all about turning the page and what happens next.
Yeah.
And turning and looking at those two images and then turning the page and what happens next. And I found that just drawing individual pictures, I could not anticipate what that would be, how the story would work that way. So I started to do, rough drawings of each page, and then scanning and printing them out small and making these little mock-ups of each chapter, which is kind of fun. It was like making a mini comic for each chapter. Then I could page through this as though I was reading the story, and get a feel for how that story flowed. And so these kind of operated as thumbnails, in that when you do thumbnail for a comic, that's when you can correct all your mistakes and everything. So but in this case, it was these little mock-ups where I made all my mistakes and made all my changes.
Awesome. At what point did you decide what medium you were going to use, what tools you were going to use for each chapter? Like, how early on was that?
Pretty much as I finished each chapter, I would say okay, what do I want to do now?
Yeah.
And it solved a couple of problems, as well as hopefully working for the book, because it gives each chapter a different feel. It kept me from getting bored, because I'd never worked so long on one book. So I kind of felt like I was doing 8 different comics, because I had to start over. And also, I think I would have this problem even doing a 10-page comic, which is my style changes over 10 pages.
Yeah.
And so if I say, well, I'm just going to change my style all the time, no one will notice if my style changes, because it's supposed to.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like each approach you took to each chapter works beautifully. So
thanks. Yeah, it was pretty much dictated by the mood, by the age that the character is. I had this idea about the sootiness, I don't know, that's a weird way to say, maybe, of really early memories. There's something like you're seeing them through a glass darkly or something. And so that worked for the baby chapter, and then the little girl chapter a little more delicate with washes and things.
Yeah. And like I mentioned before, I just feel like you took a lot of there's a lot of detail in the facial expressions, because I feel like that's just so important, especially in wordless storytelling.
Yeah.
It's that information that we need. So do you feel like, did you have to redo those often, or were there a lot of revisions for that? How long did it take you to make sure that you got that just right?
Yeah, I did it often, redrawing. And there are moments in it. I think one of the things that is appealing about wordless stories and wordless comics and wordless books is there's a kind of ambiguity, because you don't have any words that are nailing down what the character is feeling. So there are moments where it's okay, this is going to be a really hard feeling to get across, because there's conflicting things going on, and those were where usually those are kind of turning points in the story, where something is going on within a character, and you have to sum it up in one facial expression. So those were pretty hard, and especially the facial expressions of the moon, because it's she's getting something from the moon. She's getting all these messages from the moon, and what are they? And I want the reader to understand what it is that she's gleaning from that moon face. Yeah,
it's a conversation throughout the book between the two of them, and I think that's what's so I don't know, it's very successful, very intriguing. I want to get to questions in a minute, but Who would you say, and maybe this is a weird question, but who would you say this book is for? Like, did you have like a reader in mind when you were creating it, or?
I guess the real question, other than just the vast audience for wordless books, which we know is out there, was like the age of the readers.
Yeah.
Because, and I really didn't want to like make assumptions that, oh, this is for kids, even though I kind of felt this was, something that younger readers, I don't know, 11, tweens and up might really like. I also felt like it's so not like what we think of as YA comics that I was kind of afraid, so it's like while I was making it, I don't know if I really could think too much about who it was for.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a question that came after, is like, how do you label it? What category do you put in? But I think I did feel along the way, it being a picture book, like, oh, this is a children's book for adults, which I think is like probably, if you walk into most publishers' office, like the last thing they want to hear.
Well, how did you figure out, in terms of publishing, how did you make that decision about who you wanted to publish it? And can you tell me a little bit about that?
It was actually the first time that I'd done a comic on a scale where I thought, oh, I should try to take this to a publisher. Like, I thought I'll publish it myself if I have to, but I should try. I should try. And I was a little nervous about it and shy and everything. But there was this publisher, Fanfare, which is a British publisher, who I had just stumbled on their books like when I was just starting to draw comics again. And they do a lot of alternative manga, like Yuro Taniguchi, and things like that, and just a lot of really nice international translated comics. But when I saw their table at shows here in America, they just had such a wide variety of formats and really nicely published and printed books, and it was kind of so outside of any category that I thought, oh, they might like this, and that's kind of the most important thing, is like a publisher who would like it. So I actually just kind of targeted them. I only submitted it to, I think, 3 publishers, and they did like it. I was right. Fanfare liked it. So
that's great. I mean, yeah, you ideally want someone who wants your book and is excited to put it out into the world. So I'm glad that it worked out and everything.
I mean, I wasn't shy about going to them. I like went right to them, and I knew, their American representative, Stephen Vratos, and was friendly with him. So I was like, okay, I just gotta, but I kind of didn't go through, I think, what a lot of people go through trying to get a book published, which is, sending it out and waiting and, I didn't have an agent or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, it's we got like about 20 or so minutes. I want to make sure we get to some questions. And if we have some more time, we can circle back to some other things. So I'm just going to pull up some questions from, and just can get into that right now. So first question is from A. David Lewis. Does Lunatic feel as important now during COVID, and does it feel at all more important and relevant?
That must be a question that everybody who finished a book and prepared for it to come out just before COVID and had it coming out during COVID must ask themselves. And I certainly have come up with ways, I think valid, to tell myself that it is, that the loneliness that everyone is experiencing works well with this book. So yeah, COVID. I mean, there, you know, it's not bleak and depressing like that George Buchner monologue, but there's definitely, you know, strains of melancholy throughout and loneliness throughout, and, you know, having your heart be connected to something very far away that you can only see, you know, through your window up in the sky. So in that sense, I feel like the experience doesn't of COVID doesn't date the book or anything like that.
Thank you. And I would agree with you. I feel like it does feel relevant to this time. There is that longing in it. All right. So next question from Bob Skoriak. Let's see. I love how you shift between media, watercolor, crayon, acrylic. Was it for the content of the story or more a desire to experiment the way you practice painting with your left hand?
Yeah, I mean, it was both. You know, one of the things that happened just before I started, or pretty much just before I started working on this book, was I had done the Comics Global History, where, you know, with Alexander Danner, and we had set out to do this book that was a history of, you know, comics in Europe, America, and Japan, and kind of thinking, yeah, we know the history pretty well. And it turned into like this 3-year self-taught course in comics that I had no idea existed, and just kind of bombarding myself with all these different possibilities and styles in comics. And Alberto Breccia, who I talked about before, is kind of the pinnacle of that, at least of the artist who moved most from style to style. So I think, you know, it was like there was just the sense that, you know, I have to try a lot of different things, and almost like each chapter I'm thinking, okay, I'm figuring out how to use this media. Now maybe when this is done, maybe I'll do a whole book in acrylic paint, or maybe I'll do a whole book with my left hand or something like that. So it was partly just sort of to feed my artistic greediness or adventurousness or whatever. But definitely, I certainly tried to make it also work for a story where the character is at a very different stage of her life in every chapter. And I think that's really kind of crucial, that, you know, you just feel like the world has changed from chapter to chapter, for, you know, from subjectively the world has changed via the style.
I think artistic greediness can be good. I mean, it's clear that you enjoyed drawing it, like you can see it in the art, right? That's something that I think any reader wants.
Yeah, I felt like if I'm going to show off a little, that's look what I can do.
All right, our next question is from Catherine Mazur. Did you find when you were making the mock-ups that that you changed things about rhythm and pace by moving the sequence?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like this first chapter, when I looked at it just today to do this, I was surprised that the last image of the baby was just a close-up, and it didn't have that reach of the arm, which to me was like the whole thing. So it was like I got to the end of that, and it's like, no, that's not enough. That doesn't really say enough. And then I even kind of remembered that reach in a much later chapter, and have her as a, like, I think in the very last chapter when she's, you know, middle-aged, and she does again this sort of reach. But yeah, it's like, just like, nope, need more pages, you know, need another point of view shot here, need to understand better what she's feeling, so I have to show her face twice, or yeah, all the time. That really was the whole purpose of them, was like pacing and, I guess, clarity, or just the emotional impact from page to page.
All right. So another attendee asked, how do you think the book would have changed if words were included? Could it have been told that way?
From my point of view, no, it couldn't have been told that way. I think that, probably when you think of a wordless story, there is from the start a reason that it's wordless. The story can't be told any other way. It's not just a pantomime. It's so I think that probably from the very beginning, this is the story about a relationship between two characters who cannot speak to each other. So I can't think of any way to, there's always a way, there's always a way in which a picture can be translated into words, and it's something very different. But I think that I can't really, think of how it could be. Yeah, it's a horrible thought. Trying to put words in this. It was the editor, the publisher of Fanfare, who suggested that I put in at the end of the book, there's the section about the process of making it. In each chapter what I did, because he had seen that I was, blogged about that. And I was at first resistant to it because then there will be words in the book. I didn't want there to be any words in the book, I wanted people to think I was illiterate. But it turned out to be a very good suggestion.
All right, we have a few more, so I'm going to try to make sure we have time to get to all of them. So EJ asked, do you think that Lunatic being wordless gives it the potential for international distribution?
It should. I don't know. It's kind of up to international publishers. Do they consider it something that, or distributors? Do they consider it something that they can distribute through normal channels to their bookshops when it's, there are those 10, 11 pages at the end that are in English, and there's the inside front cover material or whatever. So I got to look into that.
You should.
Yeah.
All right, so Kryota asks, I don't know the story yet. I'm curious about how you chose the gender of your protagonist and if the lunar connection had anything to do with it.
Very good question, because the initial idea, it was a man, a boy, then a man. And I think at the time, it was just a kind of a generic feeling of, why should the default character be male? What if this was a girl? And it's going to work just as well. But of course, it does then resonate, presumably in different ways, especially, set in the past, especially when you have to think, okay, this is a woman, girl in Victorian times. How is it different seeing her embark on this kind of lone journey and science and all that than a guy? I think you just read it differently. I tried not to do anything differently. I think the section where she's in university, I thought, okay, well, I don't really know that much about, women in universities in the Victorian era. But I just said, well, I'm just gonna not make this a realistic Victorian era, and this is just gonna be a co-ed university, maybe even a little more women than men on the campus and in the lecture. And the lecturer, the astronomy lecturer is going to be a woman, And so it's like, I'm not really going to make this about, gender issues in Victorian times. I'm just going to make a made-up world where that's not an issue. But it's still, I think, you can't help but read it in.
Robert asked, I love the making of, partly for the information and also for the intimacy of it. Is the girl in any way autobiographical?
Yeah, I mean, sure, definitely, not purposely. Generically, like all our characters are always autobiographical or always self-portraits. So, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Comment from Patrick says, Dan, please tell the story about the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 back in July 2019. I think readers would like to hear it. Mercy. You can come back to it if
I'm blanking on that story. Patrick, will you remind me what that story was? I remember there was a newspaper spread and a big picture. Patrick, help me.
If Patrick asks another question, I'll let you know or follow up. All right, so let's see. JL says, in making Lunatic, did you try and end up discarding any artistic techniques because they just didn't work?
I don't remember that happening. The hardest one was probably acrylic paint. And I kind of dabbled with that in the first chapter, and spent the longest time kind of trying to figure it out. But in the end, I was okay with the way it turned out. So I do not remember discarding anything, unless I'm forgetting something. I wanted to learn lithography and do a chapter in lithography, but I just didn't have time to stop and learn lithography.
That's understandable, Dan. It would have been nice, but so we have 3 more questions. So I want to make sure that we can get everyone's questions answered. So someone asked, any thoughts or advice on challenges of pacing wordless comics or wordless panels?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, any thoughts or advice on challenges pacing wordless comics or wordless panels?
I think you have to do it by feel. The one thing that I tried to resist as much as possible, but it's very hard not to fall into, is kind of the cinematic storyboard, shot reverse shot, moment to moment storytelling. Someone else asked, I saw, about was I inspired by the Wordless books of Franz Maseril and Lind Ward and people like that, which the funny thing is like I sort of knew those books, but somehow it didn't occur to me that I was doing that until about halfway through making this book. And then I went back and looked at all those books. And so I did get inspired by them. But I think the thing that's great about those books is, being almost pre-cinematic, not quite. They really just do like scene by scene images a lot. They don't sort of try to or accidentally fall into aping cinematic progressions. It's more like I looked at, Hogarth, William Hogarth, in the 18th century, who's thought to be sort of a precursor of comics. And there's just these big tableaus, very complicated, images with a lot going on. And the story is told, the gaps between each image is years. So playing with that kind of, in comics terms, compressed as opposed to decompressed storytelling. So that's not a very good answer to the question. I think you do it by feel, and you kind of think as much as possible about the different ways you can pace, because there's a wide variety of pacing, and a lot of it will determine or depend on how much you are pouring into each individual image. How much do you want the reader to spend kind of moving and interpreting and exploring each individual image, and slowing it down in that way.
Thank
But it's
you.
a vast topic, it's infinite.
Do you have, this is from Jordan, do you have any advice for creators tackling larger scale projects?
What worked for me in this, and I don't know if it's how applicable, I mean, it is to other projects, is this is a very simple story that could have been told in a much shorter form, and doing it one image per page kind of allowed it to spread out and become novelistic in a way.
So I want to make sure that we're able to wrap up. Would you be able to, actually just to last question, will you be selling, someone asked, will you be selling art for the book at any point? Will you be selling prints at any point?
You were dropping out. What was the question?
There's, yeah, a question. Will you be
art
selling
for the
art for the book? You can actually just talk about the book and, you know, selling the book if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to part with the art for the book. I have a lot of kind of different drafts of pages that I think are, you know, probably no one could tell why I didn't use that draft. And I would definitely part with those. Which chapter was it that they said? The library pages. Oh yeah, and that is actually that library section is the only chapter of the book, because this was like one of my restraints, was that every page needed to actually exist as a physical page with conventional materials. And because of what's going on in those library pages with the light changing so dramatically, those pages kind of don't exist. Like the line work exists and the shading exists, and they're on separate pages. It was the only 3 pages where they're really, really photoshopped intensely.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
We're at 8 o'clock. We do have one more question if you think you can answer it quickly, Dan.
Sure.
Somebody said, I love the black and white illustrations. Did you at any point consider using color, or did you just know right away that it would work best in black and white?
Yeah, I love black and white. I don't think, well, I feel personally I should be moving on to color in some projects. For this one, I just felt like there was just plenty to do in black and white, and all of the artistic inspiration that I had, or most of it, was black and white. So no, black and white is great. Don't need color.
Thank you again to Dan and Whit for your time and this incredible conversation. And I really liked all of the inspiration that you shared via poetry and images. And thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, and indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support Dan in the bookstore, click the link in the chat to purchase Lunatic. As a reminder, he will be signing copies before we ship them out. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thank you all so much and have a great evening.
Thank you, Harvard Bookstore. Thank you, Whit. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, Patrick, I didn't answer that question.
Thank you.